Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today, for lucky number 4, we have again joining us Dr. Joe Burkes. How are you, Joe?
I'm doing great.
I'm glad you can put up with me again and come here. And just so people have an idea of what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to be looping around, but first and foremost, we are going to be discussing the virtual experience model and the different, the definition, and then the few layers and categories of the virtual experience model. After that, we're going to segue briefly to the power structure of the UFO cover-up, how and why it's maintained, and then we're going to loop back again for the main part of this show to the virtual experience model again. So let's go right into it, Dr. Joe. What is the virtual experience model?
The virtual experience model is a guide to interacting with the intelligence associated with the phenomena, extraterrestrial, interdimensional. The model addresses the issue of mechanisms of contact. And the model came about as a result of 5 years of intensive interactions that I had back in the 90s, from 1992 to 1997, in which I had multiple experiences observing UFOs and observing other witnesses. And this was called, back then, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. We were part of an initiative, network of contact workers in the Western United States primarily. I prefer the term HICE, Human Initiated Contact Event, for the reasons that we outlined in the first show, which we won't go over. So what I realized as I was going through these contact experiences and leading a contact team in Los Angeles, which was one of 3 in the Western US, Phoenix and Denver were the other 2, I found that there was a discrepancy in what people were seeing while going out in the field. These individuals were sane, sober, many skilled observers, and yet there were marked differences in what people were describing. And as time went on, I realized that the intelligence behind the phenomena was creating illusions. And I'm going to outline the 3 categories now. A close encounter of the first kind is generally a UFO being seen within 500 feet or less. A virtual experience of the first kind is a virtual experience. It's a virtual sighting, and it's of 2 types. It's either a holographic-like projection in which everyone in the field, the entire contact team, can see the object or what is a visual display, making you think it's an object. And then there's a virtual experience of the first kind, category B, which is the intelligence behind the phenomena targets individuals in the field and is able to create an illusion of either a visual object or, as we heard in the previous hour and a half that we spent together, auditory illusion. These are not hallucinations. From a medical point of view, a hallucination is an illness. It's resulting from pathophysiology, drug withdrawal, drug overdose, metabolic abnormality, alcohol withdrawal, schizophrenia. These are technologically induced illusions. And the one that most contact workers and their supporters of witnesses are going to experience are the visual type. A virtual experience of the second kind is a full sensory, illusory, matrix-like reality. Remember the movie The Matrix? More real than real? Well, what we see from the UFO literature, and especially from the very important free experiencer study, that stands for the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences. They carried out an extensive, I think up to 4,000 contact experiencers filled out questionnaires, and many of them described being taken into a kind of matrix-like reality, matrix referring to the movie, where it was not a physical contact experience, it was primarily psychic. So that's a virtual experience of the second kind. The third kind is perhaps the most controversial, and in terms of acceptance for the larger society, I suspect the most threatening. And that's a virtual experience of a third kind, which is virtual memory. I believe, as a result of reading the UFO literature and and my work with contact experiencers who had amazing medical cures, that I believe this intelligence has the capability of creating artificial memories, which are as real to you and me as what we remember we had for breakfast this morning. And this capacity of creating virtual memory or memory implants is important because it allows the intelligence behind the phenomena to access our full storehouse of memories and create memories that we recall as if it was a physical contact experience, but it may indeed be, in this category, totally psychic. So that's the contact experience, the virtual experience model in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's two things, and not to detract or get too far off, but could the virtual experience 3 almost be considered something like a screen memory? Is that similar? Or
absolutely. And this is the ironic aspect of the UFO literature. Now, I'm a contact activist. I've been part of human-initiated contact for almost 30 years. Many people look at what we're doing as crazy because they have a very dark view of contact. They believe that abductions are the only type of experience people are having, and they push that to the hilt. One of the ironies of the alien abductionist subculture is that they talk about screen memories, which are supposedly put into the consciousness of abductees in order to obscure the contact experience, so-called abduction. But the researchers who are promoting this notion, and some of them have written many books, you know who they are, Bud Hopkins, Dr. Jacobs, and others, they've never asked the question, well, if the intelligence behind the phenomena can put in a screen memory, which obscures what happened, why couldn't the entire contact event, which they use hypnosis to extract the narratives, why couldn't that also be an implanted or screen memory? Right. So this is, this is something that is cutting edge, and our shows are going into great detail, but if we ever have a show which I can focus in on the virtual memory aspect of the trilogy that I've outlined, I can get into the exciting scientific literature of memory science that's showing how scientists now, using experimental animals, are implanting memories. And if we can do this with animals, imagine what an array of super civilizations that are responsible for the UFO phenomena can do, not 100 years, not 1,000 years, perhaps millions of years more technologically advanced, not only in terms of building what we call spacecraft, but also in terms of psi and memory implants.
Yeah, I wrote that down because I think we're definitely going to have to do a whole episode on that, because that's a fascinating subject. And actually, I want to say it's kind of funny and ironic, not necessarily, just kind of with my sense of humor, but so the virtual experience model, it's actually funny. I know you've been talking about this for several years now.
20 years.
Yeah. So, but if you look at the ATIP slide 9, and I don't want to paint it in a negative light, but what I'm saying is the Pentagon was looking to these same kind of questions, the phenomenon having the ability to basically
create illusions.
Yeah, create illusions, manipulate consciousness, alter consciousness, and what they're using terminologies like cognitive human interface, and so it's really funny that this is actually coming around full circle now, where we have a slide that was used for, or was supposed to be used for briefings for the ATIP program, looking at these same topics. So that's very fascinating.
I have to remember that those people who believe it's their job to keep a lid on the UFO subject and have been engineering the massive UFO truth embargo they follow the experiencers around. Grant Cameron quotes a high government intelligence official who has a sidekick by the name of Smith, I think Dave Smith.
Dan Smith.
And Dan Smith, yeah. So Dan Smith quotes this high-ranking intelligence official as saying, we, meaning the intelligence community, can't directly interact with the phenomena. They can't control it. They can't study it scientifically because it like in the Skinwalker Ranch, it runs the show, not the investigators. So we, again, the intelligence community follows the experiencer around so that they can study us and follow us, and in the process learn the nature of the phenomena, its tremendous psychic abilities. So it's no accident that the intelligence community is aware of these issues, because as we can describe maybe later on, I can talk about the intense surveillance that our contacts teams had. Basically, when you join the contact underground, I used to tell my companions in the struggle, you'll never be lonely again. Because number one, UFO intelligence can access your consciousness as readily as you and I access light by turning on a wall switch on home. And number two, appropriately number two, perhaps, the intelligence community is following us around too. So,
yeah, and actually that same intelligence officer you're referring to, who's associated with Dan Smith, he was actually involved in observing and kind of actually using Dan Smith again to interact with the Bledsoes in a very direct way, actually. So that's a proof is in the pudding right there that that's still going on to this day.
And we know Dan Semivan is a contact experiencer, and he's a co-chair of To the Stars Academy, and he reportedly was head of clandestine operations, which is a very high position. He used to be called clandestine directorate, and he also has integrated himself as other intelligence people into the process of moving for more openness on the subject, which, and from my point of view, as we discussed in the first show, is a very good thing.
Right. Okay. So now let's since we're talking about the intelligence guys, let's move to the power structure of the UFO cover-up.
Right. Now, this is something that became aware of almost from the very beginning because of my background in peace and social justice causes. I realized when I joined the CE5 initiative in 1992 that ultimately what we are as contact workers we're part of a peace movement because of the tendency in our culture to promote military conflict. Stanton Friedman, a very famous ufologist who's no longer with us, used to call it tribal warfare. That perhaps in the universe, the United States and the rest of the world is known as the promoters of tribal warfare. And so ultimately, when the subject then becomes known to the great masses of people, there will be some who imagine that they will want to fight against the so-called aliens or interdimensionals, which is totally ridiculous, as we know from their advanced technology. It would be a fight over in 5 minutes. But ultimately, we, the contact workers who are engaging the phenomena in a proactive way, would morph into a peace movement. And one of the important steps in forming a peace movement is to understand where the opposition is. Why has this subject been kept at the level of a taboo, forbidden for 70 years? And from my perspective, as an activist, working against war, working to promote union rights, working against racism in terms of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 50s. I go back that far, yeah, I'm that old. That this subject, in my judgment, the presence of flying saucers, whether they're interdimensional or extraterrestrial or both, threatens all terrestrial elites, but not the peace-loving people of this planet. Well, who are those elites? We know that UFOs have threatened the military because if you read Richard Dolan's UFOs in the National Security State, there have been encounters between military aircraft and UFOs, engagements even, back in for the last 70 years. We've only been given a small window on it with the revelations of the ATP program, and now the UFO task force is going forward. But for military people, the reality of UFOs for decades of cover-up was that these craft could outperform their best fighter bombers. They could interact with missiles going out into space. And so the incentive to keep this quiet, to make it a taboo, was that the military leaders, for whatever reasons, did not choose to be viewed as either incompetent, either not able to so-called secure our national airspace from unwarranted, uninvited intrusions, or impotent to do so. So that was a big incentive for the cover-up. In terms of politics, you have to move back a bit and say that on this planet, nationalism is the name of the game. I'm quoting now the famous UFO specialist. Again, we all miss him very much. And nationalism is the name. Stanton Friedman as the ufologist. Nationalism is the name of the game. So you have the world split up into nation states, and the political leaders of every nation state, his or her political power comes from that entity of the nation. What will happen when the masses of people on this planet recognize that we are not alone, that advanced civilizations are here? We will see ourselves as one planet, one people, and the push for global unity, which has been going on with the establishment of the United Nations and now the proliferation of international trade and the internet, the push for national unity will continue to grow. And eventually, I believe we will have to evolve into a world government based on peace and social justice and environmental justice. What happens to the national politicians during this transformation? They're in the business of making people afraid. And yet planetary unity, which is going to be necessary to address what seem to be the insurmountable problems on our planet, global warming, nuclear proliferation, and now pandemics, nation states no longer can serve the genuine needs of the people of this planet. So we're going to have to evolve into something else. And the people who are in the business of making afraid of the Russians, and the Russians who are in business of making their people afraid of the Americans and the Chinese, every nation's political leaders are heavily invested in conflict as a way of strengthening their position. World unity means they're out of the picture. So for politicians, on the ideological sense, national politicians would want to keep this a secret in terms of the long-term prospects for global unity. Then you have perhaps the most important elite that's threatened by UFO intelligences, and that are the captains of industry. We know that the largest industry on this planet is the fossil fuel industries, coal, natural gas, gasoline. And we also know that the flying saucers are not burning coal. There's not a little ET inside the spacecraft shoveling coal into the furnace or filling it up at the gas station. These craft have tremendous capabilities, and their energy source leaves a minimum of a heat trail. There's no exhaust coming out of the craft. So they're using some kind of advanced technology. It's rumored, perhaps it's called 0 point, deriving energy from the vacuum of space. That's one possibility, or fusion or whatever. But it's likely that these technologies are not only tremendously powerful, non-fossil fuel, but they probably are very environmentally friendly because they're not producing carbon dioxide. So what would happen if the people on this planet knew, as the world situation gets worse with global warming, that the so-called extraterrestrials have technology that would allow us to eliminate fossil fuels and create energy, an abundant source, and hopefully a cheap price? Well, that's anathema, that's poison to the petrochemical industries. And so the people who make profit out of the petrochemical industries would not want that kind of alternative energy source to be integrated, downloaded into our technological culture. So from an economic point of view, the corporate elites, the oligarchs who run the economies of the world would be against revealing the reality of UFOs and, more importantly, the possibility of doing what we're doing, which is engaging the phenomena in what hopefully is a cooperative and non-harmful way. The contact workers I'm talking about, the CE5ers, people in Rama, and people all over the world who are going out and engaging this phenomena directly. So you have these three categories: military, political, economic, and then you have certain sections of the religious elite who also would find this topic very threatening. I'm not talking about the Catholic Church, which has, in my judgment, a very progressive view on the possibility of intelligence, life in the universe. I'm talking about certain fundamentalist Christian sects who say, yeah, we know who the ETs are, and they're the devil. So for people who find this subject to be a manifestation of demons, they would also want to put a lid on the UFO situation. Don't dance with the devil. And so these are the four rungs of the cover-up. And unfortunately, this analysis that I've just gone through is, you never hear it in its totality in the UFO subculture. But it became immediately apparent to me that this topic that we're dealing with is revolutionary. It can change our worldview, where we are in the universe. It can give us an insight into where our energy systems may have to go if we're to preserve this civilization from the ravages of global warming. And in terms of science, understanding that consciousness, not matter, is primary. I left out the academicians. Science is also threatened by this phenomenon, which is no other topic. So I just wanted to put that forward for people to understand where I'm coming from and why I've been so passionately involved with this subject, because I see it as potentially a peaceful revolutionary movement that will unite the planet on the basis of peace, cooperation, and solidarity, and create a just world government where everyone can thrive and make this planet into the paradise that it was promised to be, rather than what it is now, as the Buddha called it, the nightmare of the day.
Yeah, and actually the fourth group you mentioned, the religious fundamentalists, people like Luis Elizondo, who was the director of ATIP, and people like Dr. Eric Davis, who was an OSAP and who helped assist in those kind of programs, both ran into that issue where, they've been called the Collins elite. There may be others or other names, but they told them, listen, you're messing with you're basically messing with demons, so back off this one. And the funny thing about that is, like, okay, so if you ignore it, it's not going away. Even if it was a demon, right? Why wouldn't you try to investigate that and find out about it? So they were even trying to block anybody at even paying attention to it, or even investigating it at all. So that's a really interesting perspective, but that's a genuine one, and one that we know about out front, and obviously, and there's a lot of testimony credible testimony as to that actually happening and helping conceal the subject. People in high places of power who are just happen to be fundamental religious and are against the openness on this topic. But moving from there, we're going to move back to the virtual experience model. And I know there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. You have a lot of different experiences that you can share and examples.
Right. Let's briefly recap. In the last episode,
and just so people know, all the previous episodes are going to be in the description and description notes.
We talked about virtual experience where auditory illusions are created. And I gave several examples. You can, in more detail, you can just view the previous session we had. But one type of auditory illusion was described by my friend Wayne Peterson, which was very dramatic. And while his team was in the field, they heard the sounds but did not see a 747 move across the sky, horizon to horizon. They were able to recognize the sounds of the engines. Following that, they heard the sound of a Mack truck, diesel engine, boom, 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 going from horizon to horizon in the course of field work. And then finally, there was a very anomalous sound that only one person on the team could recognize. And that was Wayne Peterson, because what they heard moving across the sky while doing field work, horizon to horizon, was the sound of an old diesel World War II tractor that his grandpa used to let him ride on 40 years before when he was a little boy. So this intelligence can reach into your consciousness, extract a memory, and stimulate the auditory canal, the eighth nerve, creating that illusion of, in this case, 3 objects that were not in the sky. I then talked about ropes and mining world, which was a very intensive training session we had. It was sponsored by CSETI. We had 60 contact activists out in the Sonoran Desert outside of Phoenix. And what we had was the sound of footsteps moving through the brush. I call them invisible footsteps. There was no footprints on the ground, but you could actually interact with the sound. It sounded like a person, not so much an animal, but a person moving through the brush. Stop, we're frightened, was what 2 of the women who first heard it said. The sounds stop. Okay, one of you can come forward. And the sounds approached the witnesses. And then we also talked about anomalous ringing, tinnitus. When I got back from Mexico, we had a sighting of a large triangular shaped craft at the base of Popocatépetl volcano. When I got back from that rapid mobilization investigative team's investigation, February 1993, whenever I talked about UFOs and what had happened to me in Mexico, for about a month, I would get a very stereotypic ringing in my right ear, lasting 10 seconds, low pitch, and then go away. So these are examples of virtual sounds, all right? But virtual sightings is going to be a more important category, because this is what most people experience when they're in the field. And remember, the virtual experience of the first kind is an holographic-like projection that everyone can witness. However, a virtual experience of the first kind, category B, is where an individual's sensory apparatus is targeted. And I became aware of this as a possibility at the Ropes and Mining World in-depth training in the spring of 1993. One of the contact activists, I won't mention his name, I'll call him Fred. He was from the Denver area, and he was with his team. There were groups of 20, and at the end we would have a recap where we'd go over and debrief all the 3 teams of 20. And he said that while he was there doing field work that night, he saw a purple UFO for several minutes. And he described it in detail, yet none of the other contact workers who were part of that training, some of them were only a few feet away from him, saw it. And this was kind of bizarre. Why was he the only one who was seeing this? Some people thought perhaps he was using drugs, or he was on LSD, or he was he had psychiatric problems. We brought this discrepancy to the CSETI director, and his only response was, well, that's why it's important to have multiple witnesses present so they can corroborate one another's sightings, or in this case, not corroborate it. But this individual contact worker was not hallucinating. He did not have any major medical illness. He did not use drugs. In fact, he stayed within the contact network. He's still active today, having a very responsible job in the transportation industry and going on to retirement. So that was the first major clue that visual illusions might be a mechanism of contact. Moving along, I mentioned, I think on the previous show, that in 1993, actually 1992, a young immigrant from Belarus, that's White Russia, came to work in the emergency room. And I'm not going to give his real name. I'll call him Misha Goldman. That's a pseudonym. And he was very important because he fell into a category of what I called on a previous show, a prime contactee. This is a category of a contact experiencer who has been brought along by UFO intelligences from either childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood. The prime contactees are people like Stephen Greer and like this person I'm describing now, Misha, who are kind of like Dorothy Izat, who was a contactee in Canada and got hundreds of hours of video footage. These are people who are like living human UFO magnets. They are the focus of the phenomena. And Dorothy Izat and Stephen Greer and my friend Misha all engaged in long-term meditation processes. And Sixto Paz Wells also was a skilled meditator. He was one of the leaders of the group Rama in Peru that started even before the CSETI was established. Rama was started in 1974. And so the intelligence, if you want to talk to them, you want to talk about them in terms of agents of influence, and this is something we'll talk about later in terms of the intelligence, counterintelligence model of UFO investigations. These people become agents of influence for UFO intelligence. They attract the phenomena, and then they play an important role in establishing contact networks. We all know about Stephen Greer, Sixto Paz Wells. Well, I had my own Sixto Paz Wells or Dorothy Izat in my contact team. When he was only 21 years old, he shows up in the emergency room as an EKG tech, just recently arrived from Russia. And he made the outrageous claim that when living in Russia, I mentioned this before, I don't necessarily believe this is true, but he said that he had a dream where he would emigrate to the United States, he would have a job in a healthcare setting and do contact work with a tall, bearded, Jewish American doctor. And he claimed when he went to the work in the ER for the first time, I was the doctor. Well, there were many bizarre things about Misha, but I can tell you this, that as soon as he joined our contact team, we had a boost in the level of contact that our team had in the field. We were having a fairly good track record before in terms of sightings, but with him, with me, I had my first telepathic override. And I mentioned this before. I'll just mention it again because I think what I experience is a good guide for other contact workers. So the CSETI director had told us that there will be times when people on the contact teams will have a heads up where they'll be informed at the level of knowledge, not necessarily a voice in your head, or that could be, but when the craft are going to show up. And I put that little piece of information, back of my mind. So there I was, for the first time, Misha is in the field with us. I'm meditating, and all of a sudden, I know showtime is 2 a.m. I know a UFO was going to show up in the Northwest, one craft. I told my team about this. I said, I was working a lot of overnights back then as an ER doctor. I needed my sleep. I said, I'm taking first shift sleeping. Wake me up at 10 to 2. They did. Sure enough, right on the money. This happened again. 8 months later, when we were filming with the Fox network show called Encounters. I believe it was Fox. And at the level of knowledge, I knew that 9 o'clock was showtime. 3 UFOs were going to show up, and it was going to appear over the mountains in the Topanga Canyon where we were operating. And that session was filmed by the Encounters film group. And you can see it on the internet. And it features my contact team in the field doing a demonstration of field work. Dr. Greer was also in attendance and led the group. So telepathic communication was established. And this young man, Misha, was a draw. Now, this is October 1993. The following month was a storm, first storm of the season. It was Veterans Day. And Southern Californians love warm weather. And if the temperature drops below 40 degrees and it's raining, they think the world is coming to the end. So it happened that we were going to go out on Veterans Day, a holiday, but the first storm of the season hit Southern California. And I couldn't get anyone except Misha, who was, 21, 22 years old. So we decided we're going to go. He told me that for that session, that this was not CSETI, this was personal. And I said, what do you mean? He said he had a remote view, or what he had was actually a very lucid image in his mind that he would be driving to Joshua Tree National Park and we would have a major encounter. Well, we got on the road, bumper to bumper traffic, because in Southern California, as soon as it rains, all the grime on the highway from the last 8 months has been accumulating. When the first rain comes, it makes it very slippery. So one crash after another, and we were on the largest parking lot in Western United States, was called the 10 freeway, where traffic was crawling towards the east because of all the crashes that were happening, because people in Southern California don't know how to drive in the rain, especially when their brakes fail on slippery surfaces. So despite it took us 5 hours to get there, ordinarily is a 3-hour trip, for some reason that day, our mood that evening was very jovial. We felt high. It was like we were going to a party. And we finally, it was raining intermittently. We got on Highway 62, which takes you from the 10 freeway through the Yucca Valley. And I remember we're making jokes and laughing, and we were not high or anything, just we were very excited about the prospect of having contact. And we went through one community that was called the Morongo Valley, and some kids had erased the GO. And so we were driving through the Moron Valley on our way to have some yucks in the Yucca Valley. I mean, we were just making these crazy puns and laughing. And even before we got to our jumping off site, and I should explain that in Joshua Tree National Monument, they have wilderness parking lots called backboards. And these are specialized parking lots in wilderness areas that you are allowed to leave your vehicle when you hike into the back country. As part of the protocol, when you use these parking lots, you have to write on a piece of paper, there's forms, where you're going, how long you expect to be there, and the date, because the Park Service goes through those lock boxes, removes those pieces of paper, and if your car is still there with your license plate and you were supposed to come back at that time, they send out search parties, because in the summer, people die from exposure to heat, and during winter storms, they can die from cold and flash floods. So we were having to go there during the first storm of the season. And even before we got to one of these blackboards, wilderness parking lots, we got a sighting of a golden globe flying to the west, east to west, which was the opposite from where the storm was coming in, west to east from the Pacific. So we knew it wasn't a hot air balloon. It was amber. We signaled at it, nothing happened. When we got to our jumping off point, there were 2 UFOs, 2 golden globes, if I recall correctly, hovering over our wilderness parking lot. So we were, kind of wild at that point. Before we even got to our research station, camping out in the middle of the Little Queen Valley at the base of the Queen Mountain, they were already as if they were waiting for us. So we got to the site. Of course, we packed up all our gear. We had to trudge along a dry riverbed, which it was another interesting phenomena, is that, but as we started driving to our site, the storm had stopped, but you still could see the storm to the north moving west to east, because there were flashes of lightning in the north, and that traveled as the storm front moved. But in our Little Queen Valley, it was perfectly dry, even though there was storm activity going on in the north and then later in the south as well, which was a curious serendipitous event. So we have our backpacks and our tents and our signal lanterns and our video camera. And we set up our campsite in the Little Queen Valley, 4,000 foot elevation. It's cold, it's November, but we're so happy. Of course, we look like the Pillsbury's Doughboy, because in order to do contact work under those conditions, you have to have layer upon layer upon layer on you. So we look like two snowmen with this enormous, amount of clothing to try to stay warm. You think it's 40 degrees is cold when you're walking. Try sitting and meditating and not moving. And
for a few hours, yeah.
for 2 hours. So at the site, it was quiet. And after about 2 hours of doing nothing special, I was beat. I said, listen, Misha, I know we're supposed to have an encounter. Those Golden Globes were great, but I'm hitting the sack. I got inside my tent. I got inside my sleeping bag. And less than a minute or two later, Misha says, Joe, time to get up. I said, what do you mean? Come on, leave me alone. I got to sleep. He says, you'll be sorry. He says, you're going to miss. He is Russian. I'll imitate his accent. You're going to miss something special. It's in the sky. Come on out. And I stuck my head out of the tent and turned around, and there was a jumper. It was a point of light that was was flashing its light and looked like it was taking small jumps in the sky. Jumped out of the tent into my boots and piled on clothing. And then for the next 2 hours, starting at 3 o'clock in the morning, we had an interactive experience with a number of UFOs. The first were jumpers, and there were points of light. We actually got a little bit of video footage of it, but they were flashing very rapidly. So when it moved, it looked like it was taking little jumps, and it might have been jumping. We called them jumpers. And we signaled at them. They did not signal back in the usual photon talk protocols. One flash from us, one flash from them, 2 flashes from us, but they were flashing wildly. But then we drew in the sky various geometric forms, a circle, and we asked them to do it. And sure enough, one of the jumpers, bing, 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 traced out a circle. And then we said, okay, very good, thank you. How about a triangle? They traced out a triangle. So it was this definite interactive component. At one point, there were 2 jumpers, and then one slowly descended and ceased its flashing and looked like an ordinary star. And we'll be discussing the way in which UFOs can look like ordinary stars. And then if you pay attention to them long enough, they'll do things that no ordinary star can do. So we were very excited. And at one point, I got very emotional because I was in the peace movement as a kid, and we used to celebrate the United Nations. So in the peace organizations that I was part of, we learned the United Nations hymn, which is the song of the United Nations, and very dramatic poetry. As sure as the sun meets the morning and rivers go down to the sea, new age for mankind is dawning. Our children shall live proud and free. And then the chorus. So I started singing, as sure as the sun meets the morning. And then instead of saying United Nations, I said, United planets are in march with flags unfurled. I was getting really excited. And when I finished the first stanza, what did they do? They turned off their lights. And Misha is now laughing at me, and he says, Joe, they don't like your singing. And I was like, my God, what did I do? So at that point, we were crestfallen because the jumpers had gone away. So Misha puts his hands in his 2 fingers in his mouth. I'm not able to do it, but a lot of people can. And he made this loud whistle. And they came, and then they turned their lights on. And I used to think of all the times when I was a kid, and I would see people do that, but I could never do it. Anyway, so we called them party monsters, and we started throwing our lights up in the air. We had these chemical lights, and then we were so excited that we forgot that we had a video camera set up with a tripod, but we didn't even think about videotaping them. And we said, okay, we should videotape them. But there was a problem in that other contact teams had described when they turned on their video cameras, sometime the UFOs were camera shy and they would turn off their lights and disappear. So Misha and I had this argument. I said, no, we should document it. He said, no. We went back and forth. Finally, the jumpers, we set up our camera to videotape. And what did they do? They turned off their lights again. Again, I'm crestfallen. And we start arguing with each other. Why the hell did we turn the lights on? You were the one that wanted. No, it wasn't me. It was you, Misha. So we're arguing like we made them go away. So then Misha turns towards the east where they had been seen and makes a little speech, which is kind of funny. He says, listen, we want to take pictures to show our friends. You're our friends and we're friends with you, but we want to show pictures of you, our friends, to our other friends in the contact team. We're not going to sell these pictures to National Geographic or National Enquirer for $1 million. We're just going to do it for friendship. And I'm thinking, who the hell is he talking to? Come on.
Yeah.
After he gave his little speech, bingo, they turned on their lights again and they started jumping. So there was a different interaction going on there. This went on for about an hour and 15 minutes. One of the objects then descended to the ground and started coming towards us. And it was flashing very bright. We saw it hovering a mile away. We could actually see where the Wilderness parking lot was down the trail. We'd actually walked on a dry riverbed, which was probably a dangerous thing to do during a flash storm. Storm, you could have flash floods. We'd gotten to our site by walking on this dry riverbed. And we saw the jumper now hovering over what we thought was where our car was. And then it starts slowly coming towards us, jumping. It looked like it was touching down on the ground as it approached us, but it was very, very bright.
How big was the object? I mean, from your point of view.
Well, it was so bright that it was hard to see its superstructure with your eye. However, we were able to train our binoculars on it. And when what seemed like just a brilliant source of light, when we looked at with our binoculars, we could see it as a half moon. It was a domed object. But there was a problem with the object, the visual display. And this is significant. It was not three-dimensional. It was totally flat. What we saw through the binoculars was as if you had a piece of metal, you cut out a space of a half moon or a dome, and you looked at it through the metal. There was no depth in the object.
Yeah, and I've seen that actually before too. And the way I would describe it is it looked like an object that was impressed onto reality.
Yes, I'm going to steal that line because I'm
Sure.
going to use it.
And that actually happened during a CSETI event when I was asking for a confirmation, and I saw it. I don't think the entire group saw it, but definitely I saw it, and Dr. Stephen Greer saw it. But
Right.
there had been other times when I've seen objects again like that, where I hadn't really noticed it until you're saying it now.
Right.
But it lacks that 3D structure. It almost looks like objects impressed onto reality.
Right. So this is for contact workers who are going to go forth and engage this phenomenon, as we have ordinary witnesses. This is a very important clue that these are visual displays and are not necessarily objects, which is what is described by a virtual experience of the first kind, or also known as a VE1. So the object was jumping up and down. It looked like it touched down. It then moved past our position, again, jumping and flashing, very bright. But even as it moved to the north, it did not have a three-dimensional structure. At one point, Misha said it was time to go. And we were a short distance from the 29 Palms Marine base, and there's a naval air station, and they have helicopter gunships. And I couldn't believe it, but Misha actually told it was time for them to go, and they left, which is, and he actually expressed concern about our position. Of course, we later found out that even if the helicopter gunships had picked up these objects, what we thought were objects on radar, they probably couldn't have done a whole lot because the storm was so ferocious to the north that 40 to 60 mile an hour winds had hit the base and would have made takeoff of fixed aircraft or especially helicopters difficult. But in any case, you know, I was impressed by Sasha's expressed concern for the safety of the beings or the intelligences behind the phenomena that might have been in what we, at that point, we thought we were interacting with objects. As we went back to our cars, we noticed that we had gotten sunburned at night, which was very strange. And it was one of the craft that came in very close was on the right side. And it looked like the right side of our faces was actually brighter than the left side. I can't explain that. The sunburn faded very quickly. By the time we had breakfast, it was pretty much gone. So this is an example, I think, of a virtual experience of the first kind because of the flat nature of the objects. Because when we went across the river bed on the way out towards our car, the dry river bed, to get to our vehicles, there was where we had seen the craft repeatedly, what we thought were craft, repeatedly touching down. There was no mark on the sands. The only mark on the sands were our footprints leading out to the site. Okay, so let's move forward.
Yeah, just to be clear about that object, that was an object that you saw, both of you guys saw come from the sky down to the ground, right?
Yes, we saw that.
Was it in the sky like up there, almost like a star-like object in the sky?
For jumpers, they were constantly moving. They never, one stopped and assumed the position of a star-like object, but the other one continued, came down to the ground, approached us, and then went off. But there was the sand was not disturbed. This is another indication of an illusory mechanism, I think. I think the image was projected into our consciousness. Or I should say, no, that was not the case because we actually got video footage, all right, of it. So there was something there. There was a light. Now I'm going to give you, I'm going to move along as quickly as I can, but I want to cover two other events that happened. One of which, I should say, two other types of phenomena. You know, we're talking about the CE5 network, November 1993. A few weeks after we had this experience, Ron Russell, who was a contact worker in Sherry Adamek's group operating out of Denver, he worked as an artist, and he would paint images of space, and he was active with the network. He had a missing time experience probably the first week of December or the last week of November 1993. His experience was one of 3 missing time events that occurred across the entire CE5 network. And this is something I've talked about briefly in other lectures, but I think it's important for contact workers to know it. This is a special audience who are viewing this channel. He was just sitting around the house. He got a book to review, as prominent artists often do. People send art books to prominent artists to write a review, say something nice. He's looking at the pages, flipping them. All of a sudden, 45 minutes, an hour is gone. He doesn't know where it went. Number one. December 26, 1993. Again, Mish and I are going out because it's so cold that the rest of my team didn't want to go out into the field. And this is December 26th, the day after Christmas. And we got to the site, Little Queen Valley. And if you're an experienced contact worker, you know what the presence of consciousness is. I described it during a previous lecture with this channel. And what it is the presence of consciousness is the awareness of another mind. And I gave the example that if you're playing hide and go seek and you are in a room, you don't hear anything, you don't see it, but you know someone was there. Sure enough, you open the door of the closet, you peel back the clothes, and your cousin or your friend is hiding there. That when you go to the field, there are times when the sights are alive. There's an energy, the presence of consciousness, and you know that they're there and something exciting is going to happen. But this particular day was actually the day after Christmas. The sight was dead. The sky was overcast. And after lying there for about 2 hours trying to fall asleep, after nothing had happened, Misha gets up like there's a fire in his pants. He says, we got to go, we got to go. I said, listen, we spent all the time, took us 2.5 hours to get here. Let's sleep in, day after Christmas. He says, no, we got to go. And I was thinking, he's a young guy, he's got a beautiful fiance waiting for him in Los Angeles. If I were in his shoes, I'd want to go home too. But in any case, we put all our equipment in the duffel bags, and they got the lights and the tent. We trudged back to our cars. We were driving his souped up Nissan Maxima. And as we're driving through the town of Joshua Tree, we see something that's very peculiar. It's an old sports car. It looked like a Toyota sports car from the late 1960s that had been designed to look just like a Triumph, which is a very fancy British sports car. And we were very careful to drive slow because we knew that speed traps were set up by the local police to catch out-of-towners who were driving high speeds at night when there's no one on the road. But this was very curious that this old vintage car passed us on the road. And vis-a-vis what happened subsequently, you can understand it did have significance. We then stopped to gas up and started heading down towards Highway 10. In order to get to Highway 10, the super highway takes us back to LA, we had to go on Highway 62. Now, Highway 62 is, there's a 7-mile section where you're going down a very steep road, and it's serpiginous. The road is 4 lanes with a metal, or I should say concrete barrier, and the ravine through which this road goes is so steep that the walls of the canyon go right down to the shoulder of the roadway. And as we're driving, Misha turns around and says, hey, there's somebody following us. I turn around, we go around another curve, I turn around, I don't see anything. A few minutes later, he looks around, there's somebody following us. I turn around my head, nothing there. So we're driving now out of the canyon. And what Misha later described, which I can't verify, but he said that the 2 lights that he had seen following us had a third light that came on in between the 2, that what he thought were headlights. And then he claimed that it lifted off the road, but he didn't tell that to me. We then emerged from the canyon, you're doing 60 miles an hour, and we're approaching this hillside on the right of the road. Now, we had used this site 5-6 times already, and and I had never seen a hill this big at the entrance to the ravine. It looked like it was 400 feet high, and on the top of this hill, there was a red light. And I thought, what is that? I've never seen a red light on top. So I had this 50,000 candle power signal lantern. Since we had no action during the field investigation, I figured I'd signal at the light on top of the hill. I signaled, and the beam of the light went upwards towards the light, and it hit what I thought should have been the hillside. The hillside dissolved into mist. Ordinarily, when you fire a signal lantern at night, you're going to see chaparral, rocks, you're going to see an object. Instead, the light plowed into what looked like mist and dissolved. So that was really weird. At that point, we decided we could stop the vehicle because we were going to wait for what was behind us. That was going to, a car or whatever. And as I looked in the sky to the southeast, I see a bunch of lights. And I'm thinking, day after Christmas, what are these lights? Oh, I made a story up in my mind. I said, oh, maybe they're pilots that are flying at night to get their hours in for night flying. But these little points of light flying around, just meandering in the sky. And I look to the southeast over towards Desert Hot Springs and then Palm Springs beyond that. And we see this brilliant light coming toward us at tremendous speed. And I'm thinking, what the hell could that be? Maybe I made up an idea that, oh, this is a millionaire in his Lear jet who's coming towards us. I'm trying to explain all these unusual visual displays. And so we're stopped at the side of the road. The window's down. I've been signaling up at the light. The engine is running. And all of a sudden, something's very wrong. It's like I get dizzy. I feel like there's been a break in the continuity of my consciousness. I feel like I'm drugged. And I hear Misha, who never complained about the cold, screaming, "I'm freezing, Joe. Close the window." We then close the window. We're driving. It's dark. You can see the sun slowly coming up in the east, like embers in a campfire, dull red. I hear the sound of the engine, and then boom. All of a sudden, we're still on the same road, but the sun is now high in the sky. And I feel like I've been on the Highway 62, the connecting road, forever. We get home. I look at the clock. It's taken us 4 hours to do what shouldn't have been, because at the speed he was driving, it was the day after Christmas, and he was doing 90 in his souped up Maxima. It shouldn't have taken us 2.5 hours. A couple of days later, he said, "Joe, I think we had missing time." And then he spontaneously had recall of what he believed was an onboard experience. I'm going to leave that piece of information for later discussion, because I too started having spontaneous recall, but not of an onboard experience, but us stopping a second time and our car filling with light while we were on that dark road. The next day, Phoenix team, led by Wayne Peterson, is going into the field. And they have 7 researchers. They're doing the protocols. It's getting late. They have a fire that's keeping them warm. They decide they're going to go back to their cars with not much happening, except that the 15-minute walk to get to their vehicles took an hour. It's now 1 o'clock in the morning. It's 30 degrees. It's freezing in the high desert. And they're standing around talking about what just had happened, which it took them an hour to get to their vehicles. And all of a sudden, there's a break in the continuity of their consciousness. It's now 2 o'clock, double missing time. Okay. So I was able to put together this information. I wrote Wayne about this, and his comments were, we had double missing time. We were lucky we didn't freeze to death, because if you're in 30 degrees weather and you're just standing on your vehicles, around your vehicles, you're going to get very cold. So the intelligence behind the phenomena staged a series of missing time events that tracked through the CE5 network. And what was so interesting about this was that each contact experience, each missing time event escalated. So there was 1 person with Wayne, 2, Misha and me, Wayne, I'm sorry, 1 person with Ron Russell in Denver, 2 of us in Los Angeles team, and then 7 people from the Phoenix team. That sequence, Denver, LA, Phoenix, matched the exact itinerary of Stephen Greer as he established CE5 working groups across the Western United States. First, Denver, spring of 1991, LA, August 1992, December, Phoenix, 1992. So these missing time events were staged, and we were left with the impression that this is what the intelligence can do. Not only did it acknowledge us by staging these events, but put into the events information that we could relate directly to our organizational history, which is, I think, significant. I should stop now for a moment. You have some questions, maybe.
Well, actually, I don't want to sidetrack here too much from the virtual experience model, but is Misha still around?
Misha, I haven't talked to him in about 10 years. We had a falling out for a number of reasons, which had to do with some unethical behaviors he exhibited, which got him in trouble, not only with his employers, but also with the authorities.
Yeah.
I could get into a little bit later on, because our relationship was a very important part of what I experienced. But I always had questions in my mind as to the accuracy of some of the things he said. But I can account for the things that we did together, and I verify them. So what happened? Okay, so I'm getting to the virtual experience model again. Now, fast forward a year. It's now October 1994. We're still working Joshua Tree National Monument. I'm out there with a group of contact workers. And if you ever do field work, you know that it gets boring looking at one section of the sky for more than a few minutes. So you'll look at one part of the sky, then turn your attention to another part of the sky, another part of the sky. Okay. So there was a meteor shower going on, and every few minutes we would have a sighting of a meteor. But I noticed something uncanny. I would look at a section of sky for a few minutes, and then as soon as I looked to another section of the sky, I'd see a shooting star that looked exactly like the previous shooting star that I had just seen when I changed the section of sky that was viewing. This happened to me 5 times in a row. Every time I looked at a different section of the sky, I saw a stereotypic shooting star, look, same angle, same brightness, same color. I brought to the attention of Sasha what I had just experienced, and he said, you tell me it happened 5 times in a row for you, Joe? Do you know how many times it happened for me? I says, no, 20 times in a row. 20 times in a row, every time he had turned to look at a different section of the sky, he saw a shooting star. And I said, were they exactly the same? He said, yes, the same angle, same brightness, same length of trail. So that was an anomalous visual display that seemed to be linked to consciousness. That night, we also saw some other anomalous visual displays. People who are familiar with the CE5 initiative, the CSETI organization that I was part of during those 5 years, I left in '98, is a symbol of a triangle with 3 circles at each of the apices of the triangle. That night in October of 1994, we saw a very small, tight, equilateral triangle in the sky, which did not match any known constellation. One by one, people on the team started staring at it. We didn't really know what it was. We just kept staring at it. When finally everyone that was out in the field, I think there was 6 or 7 of us, were looking at it. And this thing had been motionless for 5-10 minutes. All of a sudden, one of the stars, quote, stars, started moving. And the other 2 chased after it. And then they faded out quickly.
Yeah.
So this was very important because it established that the intelligence behind the phenomena was staging these anomalous visual displays to alert us that they were present. The next month, November, Veterans Day, 1994, was a year anniversary of our prolonged experience where we had with the jumpers. So Misha and I go back, old time's sake, maybe we'll have an onboard experience. We were very optimistic in those days. Remember, the CE5 initiative, our stated objective was to have landings and boardings. And although this has happened with other networks like the Mission Rama, which I can get into a little bit later, I didn't really talk about their march to Paititi, where a group of young people, well, they were actually, one was Dr. Fernando Lamaco, who was 40. These were seasoned contact workers. They marched into the Peruvian jungle and had an onboard experience in August of 1990.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people listening too, I don't think they've, been through the actual CSETI working group materials, which, years ago, that was kind of most of the available information because there weren't as many lectures and things on YouTube. So the working group materials were important to study as a CE5 or heist field worker. It was important to kind of study that material and go over it. And in that material, it explicitly is discussing onboard experiences as a possibility and goal. And I think it's funny because nowadays the mentality is not in that realm. So it's funny, to note that now in that 2021, the difference in the perspective and the time. So I'm just noting that here.
And, and I have to point out that when we were in Mexico, we did have a large triangular craft that hovered at a distance of a few hundred yards from our position. And then that was February 1993, the previous summer. A group of 4 individuals with Stephen Greer had a 90 to 100 foot saucer approach them across a field and got within a few hundred yards of their position. So hovers had occurred, no landings, no boardings, but these kind of high strangeness, high proximity events made us think that at that time, landings and boardings were at least possible for us in our network. Okay.
Yeah. And
I have to point out that there are networks of contact workers who have been instructed to not be associated with CSATI or any other known group. And I am getting reports, I've received reports of actual landings and boardings, okay? But I'm not going to discuss it for security reasons. But the original goal that we were not able to achieve, but I can tell you from sources that I trust that there are individuals having memories of onboard experiences that are multiply witnessed, okay? So although that never came to fruition for me, I mean, we tried our damnedest, as you can tell from the stories I'm sharing, but I'm very encouraged that the next generation of contact workers are having onboard experiences, or at least memories of going on board with multiple witnesses, seeing them taken on board, which is important. And the intelligence services, of course, are very eager to know who they are, and I'd just rather not share any more information about that, okay?
Yeah.
So the following month, we talked about October 94, and then we're in November, having our year anniversary, that prolonged interactive event with jumpers, and we're seeing some anomalous shooting stars. One we see like zigzag, they're not going down. And then another one we see going up, which is not likely behavior of a shooting star. You can occasionally have a shooting star that will go sideways, but they're really big and bright. So I'm looking at Negri Hill to the south. Misha's next to me. It's cold, 45 degrees, clear skies. I'm looking at Negri Hill, and we're shoulder to shoulder, and I hear Misha say, "There goes another one." I go, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Above Negri Hill," and he points. There's a shooting star, and he points. He says, "There's another one." And I don't see anything, even though I'm looking at the same section of sky. So I have him point exactly to where it's happening, and I looked down his arm like the barrel of a gun. And he says, "There's another one." And I see nothing. I say to him, "Misha, were these shooting stars exactly the same?" And he said, "What do you mean?" "Well, did they have the same angle, with the same brightness?" I know they were in the same location. That's what he drew his attention to them. The same duration of the sighting. He says they're exactly the same. And I say, okay, he's allowed to see them. I am not. So I asked Misha, whoever these guys are, ask them to show me. He says, "Show Dr. Burkes." And like that, a shooting star appears over, actually it's not Negri, it's Negro Hill. And I'm pretty excited because I've asked for a sighting and I got it. And my heart starts beating because I'm understanding the significance of what this means. I said to him, what I just saw and what you just saw, is it like the 3 others that you witnessed? He says, exactly the same. I say, ask them to show me again. Show Joe. And like that, above Negri or Negro Hill, a shooting star appears. It's exactly the same as the one I've seen before and the 4 others that he described witnessing. Now my heart's really beating. We have an interactive consciousness-mediated event where anomalous visual displays are appearing on request. And I make some remarks to whoever is this agent. I say, you know, we got this thing called coincidence on planet Earth. And, you know, people are going to hear this story and say, oh, Dr. Burkes, he's a good ER doctor, you know, takes care of his patients, gets them through the night. Team comes on the next day, they survive, you know. And he may know about politics and speak some languages. But when it comes to astronomy, he doesn't know his backside to his elbow. And this is just coincidence. So I say to him, to them, whoever they are, we have this thing called coincidence. And if you wouldn't mind, please, I like the other 2 that you showed me. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate it. Could you show us one more time? This time there was a pause, whereas the other 2 were like that. It was a pregnant pause, as if to say, Burkes, don't you know what we're doing? This is staged. I count 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Finally, a pale shooting star appears over the hillside, exactly like the 2 others that I had seen, the 5 others that Misha described seeing. So this is astounding. This is an example of a virtual experience of the first kind, where both of us were able to see the last 3, but only one person was allowed to see the first. Now you could suggest that, well, maybe there was something blocking my view, or you could say that maybe Misha's vision is far better, but no, these were stereotypic visual displays. Now, 8 months later, they moved it to another level. Okay, and I guess we're getting close to running out of time, so
Yeah.
I'll make this the last story that I'm going to share. But we're now.
Sure. I'll just interject very briefly and say, you know, very significantly, I don't want to say who, but somebody in my family was out with me, and I was doing, you know, I guess you can say a HEIS or CE5 process. That was my intention for going out, and this family member just wanted to come out and join me. And I kind of, you know, I didn't want to bring them into it, but I said, sure, you can come with me. And I'm staring at a direction in the sky, clear, you know, perfectly nice, clear sky. I'm staring right at this section of the sky, and they're apparently staring in the same direction. And they said, oh, look right over there. And it was exactly where I was looking at. I didn't see anything. And I said, where? They said, right there. And 3 seconds later, a flash bulb. And I was staring exactly in that spot. I did not blink. And the first time I did not see it. As soon as they pointed it out to me, a few seconds later, I saw it. So I don't know if they, you know, saw it precognitively, or again, it's another one of these virtual experiences.
Right.
So
that's a very, and this is something that we need to discuss fully, because there are groups of investigators who are always quick to cast aspersions, and if you see something that they don't see, then you're crazy or hallucinating or lying. Okay. And what I'm trying to get people to realize is that we're dealing with a technology that interacts with our visual sensory apparatus. Now, several months later, in July of 1995, they staged another contact event. And it's a little detailed, but the details are important because it has to do with the credibility of Misha as a witness. Remember, I mentioned he was not terribly reliable in the end. And that was part of the reason why we were no longer associated with each other. But I was working with a businessman who wanted to join our contact team. I won't mention his name. I'll call him Robert. He happened to be the childhood friend of an Air Force brat. Both his father and his friend Joe grew up on Air Force bases. And one of Joe's last name was Cavett. if you remember the history of Roswell, there was a counterintelligence officer that went out into the field and verified the wreckage along with Jesse Marcel. That was Cavett. Sheridan Cavett was his name. So this businessman, who was a friend of Sheridan Cavett's son, Joe, wanted to write a book about what happened in Roswell. And Sheridan Cavett was the most uncooperative witness. He refused to answer questions. He said he was not at the Roswell Air Force Base, which was not accurate. And he took whatever secrets he had to his grave. But he was still alive back in 1995. And so Bob, who wanted to join our contact team, had this childhood friend, and he proposed that they would meet at a location, and he would propose to Joe that Joe would get the actual history of what happened, confirmation of the crash, not release it till after Sheridan Cavett, the CIC officer, now in his 70s, died. And that would be a way of Robert, who was an aspiring writer, to publish a book on one more piece of important information about the crash at Roswell. So he invites his friend Joe, and they meet in a suite in the ISIS hotel in July of 1995. He goes over the proposal, and they have a plan, and they go to their separate rooms, and he's lying in bed looking at the smoke detector, and something happens. He sees a swirl of small lights surround. First, the smoke detector goes off. The flashing red light goes off. Yeah. And then around the smoke detector, he sees like a galaxy of flashing lights. Now, I didn't really get into too much history about him, but I suspect he was a contact experiencer, because my recollection of his last words was he knew that this was a contact experience. And he got very anxious, and he said, I couldn't handle it, and I passed out. So keep that description in mind. Now, the same night that he's at the ISIS hotel with his friend Joe Cavett, I'm on the phone with Misha. And you know how we usually would talk about our wives and problems we had, getting them to believe what we were doing was more important than working every day, taking the garbage out. Every contact worker knows, that there can be a lot of stress in the family because we're running around and not taking care of other important activities. And so we were commiserating or something like that. And then all of a sudden, Misha says, oh my God, Joe, I see lights on the ceiling. And I said, what are you seeing? He sees points of light appearing and start swirling around the ceiling. He says, like a galaxy, like a solar system. The points of light then coalesce. He's talking on the phone with me, to a three-dimensional image of one particular ET being that Misha claimed he had a long-standing relationship, was the so-called Zeta, gray, short, wraparound eyes. And Misha's getting very excited. He says, he's smiling at me, Joe. At that point, he says, I'm crying. Now, I had the presence of mind to say, are you crying? Because he was not the most emotional guy in the world. Or is your eye tearing? And he said, my eye is tearing. I said, is it both eyes? He says, no, just the right eye. So again, I realized that this is a staged event. It was not coincidence that I was on the phone with him when this visuals display appears on the ceiling. And I had the presence of mind to say, put your hand in front of your eye, block your eye. Do you still see Zan, which was the extraterrestrial being, the name he went by? She says, yes, Joe, I see him still. So this was a projected image that likely, in my judgment, irritated the cornea and an energy that caused tearing of the right eye. And the image was still visible when he blocked his right eye. In other words, some kind of energy, electromagnetic or others, passed through his hand, and he was able to see the three-dimensional image of the ET. Okay,
Yeah.
tearing only in one eye. So that was a staged event that shows how one individual can have their neurosensory apparatus, the visual neurosensory apparatus, stimulated using presumably electromagnetic energy. So these two contact experiences. Now, what's important is that because I later went on to have doubts about Misha's credibility, all right, Bob in Las Vegas had the exact same type of visual display on the ceiling a few hours after I was on the phone with Misha. In other words, the intelligence behind the phenomenon wanted me to know that it's not likely that Misha made this up, because he had no communication whatsoever with Robert. They operated in totally different social spheres.
Yeah.
So that these two contact experiences, November, shooting stars, a visual display in a hotel room, ISIS as well as in Misha's room. This was the core which set me on the path to develop the virtual experience model, and then went on to find other examples as contact workers are doing that, just as you described a few minutes ago.
Now, have you written about the virtual experience model in a book or just
Yes,
online?
I'm so glad you asked that, because this is it's coming out in October of this year. It's called A Greater Reality. I have an entire chapter with references over 45 pages where I outline this entire, and the chapter that I wrote is called Human-Initiated Contact, the Consciousness Connection, and the Virtual Experience Model. And I go through this in greater detail in that chapter. So I recommend that you put on your calendar October, and when the book is being published by Ray Hernandez, who published the previous book that a chapter of mine and Preston Dennis was featured in. The new group that he's formed is called CCRI, the Consciousness and Contact Research Institute. And the book is called A Greater Reality. It'll be available on Amazon. And once it's out, you can get a hold of that and read my chapter where I go into greater detail about this and other support for the virtual experience model.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And we're going to have Ray Hernandez on this channel closer to the release date of the book, which I think now is slated for October 1st. So, of course, we're going to have Dr. Burkes in there and many other researchers and experiencers that have written chapters about that, about the phenomenon. So that's going to be definitely a very interesting book and something that's going to need to be contemplated, because you're getting out of the wheelhouse of the nuts and bolts pretty much, and you're getting into that stuff which is, we can call the greater reality, which has profound implications, and is kind of pointing to again the greater reality, that reality not being what we typically consider it to be in a materialist paradigm. Not that a materialist paradigm isn't helpful, but it's certainly not the entire picture. And it's, it seems more and more that science is unraveling that entire paradigm, and we have something new. And I think we should look into it, investigate it, embrace it, and as Lou Elizondo would say, follow the information, follow the data. Don't just cling on to preconceived notions. So I think we'll stop that here. Obviously me and you could just kick this the whole day. But I definitely want to get into the virtual experience category 3 at some point. But I think at this point it's definitely relevant that we should do an entire episode on the prime contactees. People like Misha, Dr. Stephen Greer, Dorothy Ezat, even Christopher Bledsoe and others. I think something of that nature would be also be very interesting. Sixto Paz Wells. I mean, there's so much there.
Right.
you know.
One of the stories I would like to share with the group is the story of how Sixto Pascuals and Dr. Fernando Lamaco and 4 others went to Paititi and went to an ET base in the remote region of Peru and had an onboard experience. I wanted to share that, which we haven't gone over. Also, my friend Captain Joe Vallejo, who played liaison between me and Rama for over 20 years. In August of 1994, he was taken in, he allowed, with 7 other people, they walked into a dimensional portal, a Zendra. So I wanted to get that out as well. That's a very important contact experience. And contacts are still going on at that location near Mount Shasta.
Yeah, so we're going to get into all that and more in subsequent episodes. So thank you so much for coming on again, Dr. Joe Burkes, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay, thank you so much.